In the Pacific and in Europe, men came to recognize a kind of danger that arrived before the shooter did. It was not the crack of artillery or the long, thin snap of a distant rifle. It was a faster, steadier rhythm, shots placed close together, measured and confident, as if the weapon itself had removed the pauses that once gave a man time to breathe. Japanese infantry did not hate the M1 Garand because it was mysterious. They hated it because it changed what a brief encounter could become, turning a moment of surprise into a moment of loss before the body fully understood what was happening. In a jungle line or a shattered hedgerow, that difference felt like the ground shifting underfoot, the rules rewriting themselves in real time. For the American rifleman, the Garand was not an abstraction of industry. It was a heavy, familiar shape carried through rain and dust, through sweat that turned wood slick and steel warm. It rode in the crook of an arm while men climbed ridges or crossed flooded ditches, its sling biting into shoulders already rubbed raw by packs and ammunition. The rifle's weight was honest. It did not promise safety. It promised only that when the moment came, when a shadow moved, when a slit in a bunker winked, when a figure rose from brush, the rifle would answer without the ritual pause of bolt and breath. Under mud and shock, in the hands of men who were not always calm, the weapon's reliability became its own kind of comfort, a small certainty in a landscape built to strip certainty away. The battlefield environment made that certainty valuable. Pacific humidity swelled wood and rusted metal. European cold numbed fingers and turned fine motor skills into clumsy guesses. Rifles jammed for reasons that felt personal. Ammunition collected grit. Action stiffened. A weapon that could be counted on, that could be loaded in a practiced motion and kept firing without delicate fuss, mattered more than any diagram in a manual. The Garand's semi-automatic action meant that recoil and recovery became a rhythm rather than a task. The rifle stayed in the shoulder. The sight picture returned quickly. The man behind it could keep his eyes forward, could keep his attention on the ground that wanted him dead. Across that ground, Japanese troops often fought with discipline built around timing, holding fire, letting the enemy close, using concealment to make the first seconds decisive. That doctrine relied on creating hesitation in the attacker, on forcing him to pause, to seek cover, to lose momentum. The Garand complicated that. A squad could answer an ambush with more immediate volume, not wild spraying but sustained pressure that made movement dangerous. It reduced the spaces between decisions. It punished the moment when a defender revealed himself and expected a slower reply. Even when the Americans were surprised, the rifle gave them a way to fight back while scrambling, while dropping, while dragging a wounded man behind coral or into a ditch. Hate, on a battlefield, is not usually an emotion that blooms all at once. It accumulates in fragments. The memory of a patrol that should have slipped away but did not, the sight of a comrade hit while trying to work a bolt, the understanding that the enemy can keep firing while you are still completing a familiar motion. The Garand became a symbol of that accumulation. Not magic, not myth, just a tool that made short fights shorter and made mistakes permanent. By the time men learned its sound, they also learned what it meant. Somewhere ahead, Americans could keep shooting, and the next few seconds were going to cost someone everything. The technical mismatch was not only in the number of rounds a rifle could hold or the speed at which it could be reloaded. It lived in the small physical acts of fighting. A bolt-action rifle demanded a sequence, lift, pull, push, lock, that stole a fraction of attention each time. Under calm conditions that fraction seemed minor. Under incoming fire it was heavy. It meant the shooter's cheek left the stock, his eye lost the sight picture, his hands performed a mechanical ritual while his brain tried to remain in the fight. In contrast, the M1 Garand allowed the American rifleman to stay inside the moment. The recoil came, the rifle rose, and then it settled again with the next round ready, the man's body remaining in the same posture of aggression. On the ground, that difference altered the tempo of an encounter. A Japanese ambush relied on the first burst of surprise and the seconds of confusion that followed. Men rose from concealment, fired, shifted, and expected the enemy to pause, expected that the Americans, forced to cycle bolts or regroup, would lose their forward pressure. But Garand fire could answer almost immediately, not as scattered reaction but as a steady hammering that made the ambushers feel exposed the instant they revealed themselves. Even a few American riflemen, firing rapidly and accurately enough, could create the sensation of a larger force. The effect was practical. It narrowed the windows in which Japanese troops could reposition, withdraw, or close distance without being cut down. The oppression came from how the Garand supported movement. In a fight, the side that can shoot and shift at the same time owns the ground. A Garand-equipped squad could lay down suppressive fire while another element moved, and then swap roles without the long pauses that bolt actions imposed. The rifle became part of a system. A man could fire, glance, take 2 steps, fire again, and the rhythm never truly broke. The Japanese soldier watching from brush or rubble felt that system as constant threat. He could not count on silence. He could not assume the Americans would stop shooting long enough for him to move safely. Open ground, already dangerous, became a thinner strip of death. This was not a story of incompetence. Japanese infantry were often skilled, brave, and disciplined under conditions that punished all human beings. Their bolt-action rifles were accurate and lethal, and their tactics relied on patience and careful use of terrain. But a tactical method can be undermined when the enemy's baseline firepower rises. The Garand raised that baseline. It did not guarantee victory, but it made certain forms of defense less forgiving. A man who hesitated, who misread distance, who stayed exposed for 1 second too long, could be hit by a second or third shot that would not have existed in a slower exchange. Emotionally, the change was subtle at first. It began as confusion. Why the enemy's reply felt so immediate, why the air stayed full of bullets instead of pulsing in distinct waves. Then it became an adjustment of instinct. Men who once believed they had time to correct an error learned that time had shortened. The hate was not romantic. It was the sour recognition of a new battlefield rhythm, one that did not grant the old pauses. When the Garand's 8-round clip emptied, the ping of the ejected clip was real, but so was the speed of the reload. The gap was not long enough to build a plan around. It was only long enough to remind a listener that the rifle was ready to start again. The escalation of the Garand's impact was not confined to technical comparisons. It was written into outcomes. On patrol clashes, the first exchange could decide whether men remained a unit or became scattered individuals fighting for survival. A Japanese squad that opened fire and expected the Americans to break might instead face a rapid, organized response that pinned them in place. The ability of American riflemen to keep firing while others moved meant that a small contact could harden quickly into a trap. A retreat route that seemed safe a moment earlier could be stitched with bullets as Americans advanced under cover of their own sustained fire. In bunker assaults and close jungle fights, semi-automatic volume changed the texture of suppression. A defender behind a slit relied on timing, lean out, fire, lean back, minimizing exposure between shots. Against a slower responding enemy, those moments could be exploited. Against Garand fire, the slit could be watched continuously, punished whenever it blinked. The American rifleman did not need to wait for a perfect chance. He could fire a quick pair, adjust, and fire again, keeping pressure constant. That pressure shaped decisions. It reduced the moments when a defender could safely throw a grenade, shift to a different firing port, or signal to a nearby position. The cost spilled into the struggle to retrieve wounded. A man hit in a lane of fire was not merely a casualty. He was a weight placed on the unit's conscience. Japanese tactics sometimes relied on that weight, counting on Americans to expose themselves to rescue their own. Garand fire made that rescue both more possible and more perilous. Possible because Americans could put more rounds downrange to cover movement, perilous because the enemy also felt the intensity and might answer with grenades or close-range counterattacks. The battlefield became faster in its punishments. A mistake did not always offer time for correction. A man who stood too tall could be hit twice before he fully dropped. Psychologically, repeated exposure produced a specific dread. It was not the theatrical terror of a monster weapon. It was the tightening caution that spreads when men feel watched by a system rather than a single shooter. The Garand became part of the environment like rain or darkness, predictable, present, and difficult to escape. In that environment, Japanese soldiers learned to fear moments that once felt manageable. Crossing a small gap, rising to relocate, shifting a rifle barrel to a new angle. Each act risked drawing immediate, sustained fire rather than a single shot. The mind began to measure exposure not in seconds but in fractions. For American riflemen, the rifle was a lifeline, but it also demanded endurance. Sustained fire meant sustained responsibility. A man could not simply shoot. He had to decide when and where, to conserve ammunition even when fear urged him to empty clips. He had to maintain discipline under pressure, to avoid wasting rounds into foliage or smoke. The Garand's advantages did not erase fear, they gave fear a tool. That tool could save a squad, but it could also tempt a man into believing that fire alone could solve what terrain and concealment complicated. As patrols repeated and fights blended into one another, the Garands' role in memory grew. Japanese survivors did not remember it as a model number. They remembered it as a rhythm that turned a brief encounter into an irreversible one. Americans remembered it as a weight in the hands that kept returning, a mechanism that worked when their bodies wanted to stop. Between those memories sat the same truth. The rifle did not change courage, but it changed tempo, and tempo on a battlefield can decide who lives long enough to be brave again. Adaptation began the way it often does in war, quietly, with men learning from losses they could not afford to repeat. Japanese units emphasized concealment even more heavily, seeking to deny the Americans the chance to bring their sustained fire to bear. If the Garand's strength was its ability to keep pressure constant, then the counter was to make targets vanish, to strike and disappear before that pressure could be organized. Camouflage became not just a skill but a necessity. Positions were improved, firing ports narrowed, fields of fire arranged to punish movement. The aim was to keep the fight close, short, and decisive, ranges where a grenade, a bayonet, or a sudden burst could compress everything into chaos. Closer engagement ranges were a double-edged attempt to reclaim control. In dense jungle or broken terrain, Japanese soldiers sought to close the distance where semi-automatic fire might be less decisive than shock and surprise. They tried to force Americans into moments of confusion, close enough that sight pictures were brief, close enough that smoke, darkness, and fear broke the clean rhythm of aimed shots. Coordinated fire lanes were sharpened so that when Americans advanced, multiple positions could open at once, overwhelming any single squad's ability to respond, even with Garands. In these methods there was skill and courage, and sometimes it worked. Men died on both sides at distances where a breath could be heard. Yet the limits of adaptation were always present, because adaptation cannot fully erase material imbalance. American units often had more ammunition, more replacements, and a doctrine that assumed sustained fire as a baseline. Even when surprised, Americans could often respond with volume that stabilized the line long enough to bring up mortars, machine guns, or additional squads. A Japanese unit could win a firefight and still be ground down afterward by the next wave of pressure. The Garand's reliability in dirt and stress mattered here. In rain, in mud, in sweat-soaked hands, it tended to keep working. That was not romance. It was engineering and production quality translated into survival. Japanese countermeasures also included a harsh focus on targeting. If the Americans relied on rapid fire to maintain momentum, then leaders, radio men, and automatic riflemen became priority. But identifying those men in a chaotic fight was not simple. Americans were often visually similar under grime and fatigue, and the moments when a target revealed himself were brief. A Japanese rifleman might line up a shot, cycle his bolt, and find that the opportunity had already moved. Meanwhile, the American fire rhythm did not easily pause. Even when a Garand man went down, another could step into his place with the same weapon and the same mechanical advantage. The emotional tone of this turning point was frustration kept under discipline. It was the feeling of meeting an enemy whose courage was not necessarily greater, but whose tools kept returning fire. Japanese soldiers could be brave and still feel pressed by tempo they could not fully control. Americans could be exhausted and still keep advancing because their rifles allowed them to suppress threats that would otherwise stall them. In this space, courage became something more complicated than willingness to die. It became willingness to function, willingness to keep aiming, keep moving, keep making decisions when the mind begged for a pause. For Americans, the Garand also had a cost in the kind of war it encouraged. Sustained fire could make units more aggressive, more willing to push into uncertain terrain. That aggression sometimes collided with mines, hidden positions, or close-range counterattacks. The rifle's advantages were real, but they did not make the battlefield safe. They made it faster, and faster wars can feel less human because they leave less time for reflection. Men did what they had to do, then carried it forward as memory rather than conversation. In the end, Japanese adaptation was real and sometimes deadly. But it fought uphill against a weapon that represented more than its metal and wood. It represented a steady returning pressure that was hard to outrun. The turning point was not that Japan found a perfect answer. It was that Japanese soldiers recognized the Garand not as a trick to be solved, but as a baseline reality to be endured, worked around, and sometimes paid for with lives when endurance and ingenuity were not enough. To understand why the Garand's impact felt so heavy, the story has to widen beyond the rifle itself. The weapon was a node in a larger American system: training, logistics, replacement flow, and doctrine that turned industrial output into battlefield tempo. American infantry doctrine emphasized fire and movement, and the Garand fit that logic the way a key fits a lock. Squads were taught to maintain pressure, to keep enemy heads down while others moved, to avoid the paralysis that comes when a unit stops and becomes a target. That doctrine could be executed more smoothly when the average rifleman could fire repeatedly without breaking his stance to cycle a bolt. Ammunition abundance mattered in ways that were both practical and psychological. A man who believes he can keep shooting behaves differently from a man who must count every round as if it were the last. American supply chains, while strained and imperfect, often delivered enough ammunition that squads could sustain suppression longer, could fire to cover movement, could punish an exposed position until it quieted. Japanese supply, especially late in the war and in isolated garrisons, could be tight. That tightness shaped behavior. Fewer shots taken, greater dependence on surprise, greater pressure to make the first moments decisive. When that decisiveness failed, the imbalance became painfully visible. Replacement flow was another part of the system. American units suffered, but they often received reinforcements. Wounded men might be evacuated. Fresh soldiers arrived, sometimes frightened and inexperienced but present. Japanese units, depending on the theater and stage of war, often did not have that same replenishment. Losses could be final in a way that narrowed options. When soldiers spoke of hate, it often attached itself not only to the Garand's fire but to what the Garand represented. A force that could keep coming, keep advancing, and keep filling the line with new rifles and new hands to carry them. The personal residue showed up in how men remembered tempo. Survivors described fights that felt one-sided not because the enemy never bled, but because the exchange did not pause. A Japanese soldier might fire, cycle, fire again, and in those fractions of time the American line kept putting rounds into the air, into tree trunks, into the edges of cover, forcing him deeper into concealment. The battlefield became a place where movement was taxed more heavily. A man who might once have repositioned after a shot learned to stay still longer, to risk being flanked rather than risk being seen. Stillness can be a tactic, but it can also be a trap when the enemy uses sustained fire to maneuver around you. For American riflemen, the system had a different emotional imprint. The Garand was dependable, but dependence can feel like a contract. Men cleaned the rifle obsessively when they could. They guarded their clips. They learned the feel of the bolt and the weight of the loaded weapon as intimately as their own hands. In quiet moments, the rifle became a companion that did not judge. In fights, it became the difference between being pinned and being able to push forward. That dependence could harden into superstition or ritual, not because men were foolish, but because they needed something to believe in when everything else felt unstable. This chapter also complicates simplistic claims that a single weapon won battles. The Garand did not replace artillery, tanks, air support, or leadership. It did not eliminate fear or guarantee good tactics. It was effective because it lived inside a larger framework that supported it. When American units had poor leadership or were caught in well-prepared positions, they suffered regardless of their rifles. When Japanese units exploited terrain, patience, and surprise, they inflicted terrible losses. But over time, the Garand's influence on tempo became a consistent pressure that shaped outcomes at the small unit level. What Japanese troops hated, then, was often the feeling that the battlefield's rhythm was no longer theirs to conduct. They could still fight with skill and courage. They could still win moments. But the American system, rifle, ammunition, doctrine, replacement, made those moments harder to hold. The Garand became the sound of that system made audible, a mechanical insistence that kept returning, even after fatigue, even after shock, even after the first plan failed. The resolution is not a revelation that the Garand was secretly terrifying, nor a claim that Japanese soldiers were uniquely shaken by it. The real reason Japanese hated the M1 Garand was simpler and more sobering. It quietly reduced the space where their infantry methods could breathe. Japanese tactics often depended on controlling the first moments: concealment, surprise, decisive bursts, then withdrawing or shifting before the enemy could organize. The Garand narrowed that window. It allowed Americans to respond faster and sustain pressure longer, turning the first seconds of contact from a Japanese advantage into a contested, dangerous exchange. On the ground, the rifle's effect was experienced as a loss of control. A defender who exposed himself to fire a carefully aimed shot could be answered not by a single reply but by a quick sequence that forced him down again. A unit that hoped to reposition after an ambush found the air filled with bullets that seemed to continue without the pauses they expected. This was not fear of a magic object. It was fear of a tempo that refused to slow. In war, tempo is not just speed, it is the ability to dictate what the other side must do. The Garand helped American squads dictate those requirements. Keep your head down, delay your movement, hesitate at the wrong moment. For Americans, the rifle was not an emblem of cruelty. It was a means of survival in environments that punished hesitation. A rifleman depended on it while crossing fields, climbing ridges, moving through jungle where every rustle might be a threat. The Garand's semi-automatic action allowed him to stay engaged, to keep his eyes forward, to fire and adjust without breaking his stance. That reliability did not make him brave, but it supported his bravery when fear threatened to interrupt it. It allowed a tired man to keep functioning. It allowed a frightened man to keep returning fire instead of freezing. For Japanese soldiers, courage did not disappear in the face of the Garand. Many fought with extraordinary determination even as conditions worsened. But the rifle's presence meant that courage alone could not restore the older firefight rhythm. The bolt-action ritual, accurate and lethal when used well, was still a fraction slower, still demanded moments of mechanical interruption. In the worst moments, that interruption felt like the enemy's advantage becoming physical. A man cycled his bolt and in that instant the American rifle continued its steady insistence. That insistence could feel personal even when it was not, because it arrived repeatedly, close together, and with enough accuracy to make every exposure costly. The hatred attached to the Garand also reflected what it represented. Industrial capacity translated into a weapon held by ordinary infantrymen. It suggested a war that could be fought not only by elite marksmen or specialized troops, but by a broad line of riflemen who each carried a higher baseline of firepower. That baseline added up. It made ambushes harder to exploit. It made withdrawals harder to execute. It made short-range fights more unforgiving. In the end, hatred in wartime often begins as recognition. Recognition that the rules have shifted, that familiar solutions no longer work as reliably, and that the shift is unlikely to be reversed by courage or cleverness alone. The Garand did not make Americans invincible, and it did not make Japanese soldiers less determined. But it changed the tempo at which small unit combat unfolded, and in a war measured in seconds at the moment of contact, that change could feel like the difference between fighting a man and fighting a machine that never quite stopped firing.